get started. So thanks a lot for coming. It would obviously be great to be with you in person, but I think this will do for now, and maybe at some later stage I can get to know you in person. So this project is called Indebted Demand, and it's joint work with Atif Mian and Amr Sufi. And the basic idea behind this project is that we'd like to explore the possibility that the overall amount, the level of debt an economy has accumulated in the past might weigh down on aggregate demand and hence on natural interest rates. And maybe that's an explanation for why we see low natural interest rates around the world right now. Okay, so that's sort of the key idea. So this is mostly a theoretical paper, but let me just set the stage a bit by showing you a few plots, some of which you're probably familiar with. Okay, so here on the left, you see total debt to GDP, which includes government, household, and non-financial corporate debt in the advanced world, across advanced economies. And on the right, you see real interest rates, also in the advanced world. And basically what I want you to take away here is that over the last few decades, we've seen a huge increase in debt to GDP. And also we've seen a huge decrease in real interest rates. Now, obviously the real interest rate is the price of debt. And so you would think that there's a link between, from the right plot to the left plot, that, if the price of debt falls, naturally people are going to take out more debt. But what we're going to argue and explore in this paper is whether there could also be a link between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So coming from high debt levels that have been accumulated towards explaining why interest rates have to be low in order to create enough demand to satisfy full employment, and why this can obviously lead to a problem if these interest rates hit the zero lower bound, in which case full employment is hard to achieve. Okay.
Ludwig?
Yeah.
May I interrupt you there? This is Ernesto.
Yes.
Going back to the motivation, I think that this graph gives you a great opportunity later to test the theory, in the sense of the two figures don't start at the same time. So probably the falling of the interest rate before 1980 may be less or more, I don't know, related to the rising of debt experiencing at the same time.
Right. So let me emphasize here that most of the increase in debt has been happening since around 1980. And this is where also most of the decrease in interest rates has come from. Now, obviously, some of those high interest rates here reflect the response to high inflation we had in some economies, including the US in the 1980s. But not all of it. So you can correct for that. And there's obviously lots of papers, Laubach, Williams, et cetera, that correct for that. Now, there were, before the 1980s, before the 1970s high inflation period, there were low interest rates, basically from World War II onwards to the late 1960s. And those, in my view, are partly representing, things like financial repression after the world wars to get government debt down. But honestly, I don't have a perfect answer to explain why these interest rates were relatively low. I know that since we moved to away from Bretton Woods towards a flexible exchange rate regime, we have seen higher interest rates in the mid 1980s and 1990s, and that those have come down. And this is pretty well documented that there has been a reduction in interest rates. What exactly happened before the 1970s is still a bit, a gray area to me, and that's still something that we need to understand better. But right now, let's focus on where the most of the action has happened, which is since 1980. Okay, so basically, what I would like to do now is just to dig a bit deeper into the debt levels here and try to understand what exactly those represent and who's holding that kind of debt. Okay, so before I do that, this is just a plot that shows, after COVID, we expect this to keep going, obviously. Okay, so now let me dive into the composition of that debt. So this is, again, for the same countries, 14 advanced economies or so. We see that, again, since around, 1980, late 1970s, household and government debt has strongly increased. And I lump those two together because I think of them as sort of financing the demand side of the economy. Whereas corporate debt, I think of as financing the supply side, innovation, investment, etc. And that has also increased, but not as strong. So most of this inflection point is driven by household and government debt. And now for the US, we can go even further. In fact, we can trace back any position of household debt that's been taken out in a given year to the original owners, the creditors that are on the other side of that debt contract. And this is something we do in a companion paper of ours, which is called The Saving Glut of the Rich. And so this is what we get when we do this for household debt in the US. And what I find pretty staggering here is that most of the creditors of household debt, I think this is 2016, are the top 10% of the wealth distribution. So it's very rich Americans that hold household debt, either directly or indirectly. And if you add the rest of the world to that, then you see that basically around 70% of US household debt is owned as creditors by people that are either very rich or that are abroad and thus have low spending propensities on American goods. And this is going to be sort of the perspective that we're going to take in this paper. We're going to basically explore what happens when a buildup of debt leads to a resource transfer from borrowers who took out that debt towards people who don't spend, who don't have the same spending propensities on, American goods or a specific economy's goods that relative to the borrowers who took out that debt. Okay, so that the debt service payments then from borrowers to savers would reduce aggregate demand. Okay, so this is the idea that we want to explore in the paper. And we're going to do so in a mostly standard economic framework with one exception. Okay, so we write down a standard two-agent endowment economy. And the one exception, the one ingredient that we put in that we think is necessary to make this, to explore the story, is something that we're going to call non-homothetic consumption saving behavior. And basically what this is going to imply is that the richer a household is in that setting, the higher the fraction of saving out of income that household is going to make. Okay, and this is going to have the simple sort of the implication that we're going to call indebted demand, which is basically the idea that any shifts in policies now that stimulate demand today by raising debt levels will reduce aggregate demand in the future. Why? Because that debt has to be serviced, and those service payments will basically take resources every period from borrowers and hand them to savers. And that permanent redistribution will lower aggregate demand precisely when the rich have a higher saving. Okay, that's why this non-homotheticity is crucial.
Sorry for interrupting you. Alvaro Aguirre wants to ask a question. Sophia, could you unmute Alvaro?
Yes, give me a minute.
Hi, Ludwig.
Hi.
Just can you explain again the graph? The graph that you showed was too fast.
This one?
Yes, please.
Absolutely. So the details are in this companion paper, but let me just not go into the full details, but let me give you the high level overview. So basically what we do is we take American households and sort them along the wealth distribution. And then we see what these households invest their money in. And so this might be, a deposit, this might be, a bond mutual fund, this might be equities. And then for each of these instruments, we use the flow of funds of the US to impute how much household debt, let's say, mortgage-backed securities, is held by each of these asset classes. And then what we get from that is a distribution of household debt holdings across the US wealth distribution. and also of foreigners that invest in, say, mortgage-backed securities. And basically what this shows here is the distribution of household debt holdings. So, who the creditors are behind any household debt, behind the total amount of household debt that US households took out. And you see basically that, a large fraction of this household debt is held by the top 10% of the wealth distribution, so by the richest 10% of Americans. And also a large fraction is held by investors overseas, which are, typically large investment funds, either in, mostly in Asia, like, Japanese, I don't know, pension funds or central banks in Asia. So this is the picture that emerges from this analysis. And so the details are in the companion paper, and I hope I addressed your question. If I'm happy to go into more details if you like.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
There is an additional question. Sorry about that. Michael Perez, signal.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. How are you? This
Good.
is a very interesting figure. This is from one point in time, right?
Yes, exactly.
So do you know how this has changed over the period you're looking at? Because one very simple explanation could be, now it's more rich people who borrow, so the risk premium is going down, the credit risk premium, and that's why you have those lower interest rates, for example, or more wealthy countries, or I don't know.
So I'm not sure I'm following why a reduction in the risk premium would mean a reduction.
For example, the figure you're showing now is today, right?
Yeah, like I think 2016. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you see the same picture from the start of the period, is the distribution the same or has it changed? Maybe it was the less poor who borrowed before.
Oh, I see. So this, just to be clear, this doesn't show borrowing, right? This just shows the creditors.
Yes,
we have a plot as well where we difference it out. So this is a great question. So let me answer first that this plot has changed over the past few decades. Now, notice that this is a distribution, right? So this always has to sum to 100. So what has been happening is that this green bar was not that large in like 1960 or 1970. And that's because the rest of the world has massively moved into US assets, but more so government debt than household debt. Household debt is still mostly owned by rich Americans. Now, one thing that has happened is that there was obviously a lot of, the level of household debt increased dramatically. So this you can see here because this is, adds up to 100%. And the level has increased massively, and that was mostly due to borrowing in this orange and red, in these orange and red brackets, right? Mm-hmm. So basically the 50 to 90th percentile of the wealth distribution is the key driver behind the increase in household debt in the US.
Okay, just to understand it. So this is the demand graph.
This is the asset position of households.
Sure.
This is exactly. So this is how they hold household debt as creditors, sure. Not as debtors. Yeah, exactly. Okay. No, important to clarify. Thanks for stopping me there. And just to be clear, that liability side. So who were the people who took out household debt as a loan or a mortgage? Those were the people here in this group, right? I don't know if you can see it, but the orange and red bars here. And those people, interestingly enough, those people didn't, increase their saving in any other asset to counteract that. In fact, they, on average, even dissaved in other assets as well. So this was, this household debt, increase in this area was sort of part of a larger dissaving that happened in these groups of the wealth distribution. Okay, so basically, this paints this picture that there's, the rich in the US that are making loans to the less rich, okay? And this is what we're trying to capture in this model. And so what are the implications? So first, in our model with this homothetic consumption saving behavior, one thing that's going to come out very naturally is that any increase in income inequality will already depress natural interest rates. And that is obvious because, an increase in inequality means more resources go to, towards richer savers rather than less rich borrowers. But in our economy, this will be amplified because an increase in inequality, which reduces interest rates because there's no more saving to go around, that will increase debt levels because borrowers see it's as I said, the interest rate is the price of debt, so borrowers think it's a better time to borrow. And that increase in debt has sort of a second round effect on natural interest rates, because they then take out more debt that leads to resource redistribution on top of the increased inequality from borrowers to savers, and that reduces interest rates further. So there's kind of a feedback loop, a spiral that's happening there. The second implication is that monetary and fiscal policy have limited ammunition when they rely on debt creation. So why is this? Well, let me give you an example for monetary policy. Imagine a central bank cuts the interest rate, and that leads to more debt being taken out. So that's great in the sense of, from the perspective of the central bank in the short run, right? That increases demand, that gets people into jobs, that's great. But then once that effect fades out and there's no more new debt that's being created, now all you're left with is higher resource flows from the people who borrowed, which tend to be sort of the spenders in the economy, to richer savers who finance that increase in debt. And then you have the reverse effect. And now you have a reduction in demand relative to where you started from. So you have a reduction in the natural interest rate. And so what our model suggests is that there's a tight link between monetary policy, interest rates and the natural rate of interest. So they're tightly linked. This is not just, like in Milton Friedman's original work. There's no sort of decoupling between the interest rate and the natural rate. The third implication is that once there's too much debt, the natural rate of interest could be so low that it falls below its effective lower bound. Okay, and so in that case, we're going to find that the economy can be in a permanent liquidity trap, which we're going to call debt trap, just because it's driven by too much debt. And so once you're in that debt trap, which is maybe one perspective on, say, the advanced world right now, more debt would not help in the long run. It would make things worse in the long run, precisely because, it's the source of the problem in the first place, and so it can't be the cure of the problem as well. Now, what will help in our setting is redistributive policies. Okay, so for instance, redistribution from savers towards borrowers is one thing that would help, but there's a whole host of other things like public investment programs, maybe increasing educational attainment and among the non-rich, etc. That can also help. Okay, so this is the basically where this is going, and if there's no questions about this, I will jump straight into the model. Okay, great. So what's this model? So I said we were going to start from a very canonical model, two-agent endowment economy, and then we're going to add in sort of this one additional feature, this non-homothetic saving behavior. So this model is a deterministic, infinite horizon endowment economy in continuous time. Okay, and the endowment is going to be fruits that fall from trees. So there's going to be real assets, and those are going to bear fruits or goods, and these goods and these trees are going to be owned by two separate dynasties. So one dynasty here are the borrowers, and the borrowers, they're denoted by little b, and they have an endowment of omega b. The other dynasty are going to be savers. They are denoted by little s, and they have an endowment omega s that's strictly greater than omega b, okay, which is why they're richer. And so the total endowment is normalized to 1. So there's one set or one continuum of trees and one continuum of goods that are produced by these trees every period. And we're going to assume that these trees are non-tradable. You can think of them in some sense as maybe your human capital or maybe investments in businesses that the rich made in the past and that then bear dividends. But we're going to allow them to trade debt contracts. So the only sort of state variable that's going to move around in this economy is the degree to which borrowers are indebted relative to the savers. And finally, we're going to assume that within each dynasty, there's sort of a life cycle, in the sense that some time people, members of the dynasty die, and then they're going to replace by a newborn at the same rate. And we assume that these newborns just take over the wealth positions of the ones who died. Okay, so now let me show you what these dynasties maximize in terms of utility, and this will clarify exactly where the non-homotheticity is going. So we're going to denote dynasty I's consumption by CI and wealth position, total wealth position, by AI. So we're going to assume that every dynasty maximizes the discounted flow of utilities, where the discounting is not just the discount rate rho, but it's also the death probability delta. And the stream of utilities is the flow consumption utility, which we specify for simplicity as a log. And then there's this warm glow bequest motive. So with probability delta, death probability, you get that warm glow, and we write it as V of A, where V is a general function for now. Okay, the budget constraint is entirely standard. You earn the return to your assets, and you can increase your assets with that, or you can consume. Okay, now what's that V function? So that V function will be exactly where the non-homotheticity comes in. So literally speaking, it's the utility from bequests you leave behind. Not literally speaking, this can be a large set of things. This can, for instance, be used to model that maybe you get value from your offspring's consumption. This could also mean maybe you get value from having a certain status in the economy because you have a large pile of wealth. Maybe this is value that from gifts you make to university endowments. Or maybe this is also adjustment frictions that you suffer because you have your money, say, in a illiquid account or an illiquid investment that you can't really get it out, so you can't really use it to finance consumption. So a whole host of different things can be captured in this V. Now, for us, the key object to characterize what behavior this V function introduces is going to be eta. Okay, so we define eta as A times V prime. Or in a more intuitive way, it's going to be V prime divided by 1 over A, where 1 over A in some sense is the derivative of log evaluated at A. So why am I saying it this way? Because basically this way, you see that it captures the relative margin utility of VA relative to the log utility of consumption. And so this ratio characterizes exactly what happens when I take an agent from the model and make that agent richer. Because if I make that agent richer, and let's say the margin utility of putting $1 more into the asset, which is V prime, decays less quickly as I make you richer, then the margin utility of consumption, then the saving rate, if I make you richer, will decline. Right? Because overall, you're at some point, you're going to find it more attractive to build up more assets rather than to spend more. Okay, so in that case, you would have a non-homothetic model because, for instance, eta would increase in A because the marginal utility of V decays less quickly. Now, the benchmark model would be one where V is like a log function, proportional to log, because in that case, it's fully homothetic. If I double your wealth in that case, you would double your consumption and double your saving. And so the saving rate in that model would be completely independent of your wealth. So we're going to be, as you might have guessed, we're going to be mostly interested in the case, in the non-homothetic case, where eta is increasing in A. Could also be decreasing, but I'm going to try to convince you that that's maybe not so plausible. Okay, so what is this wealth, this A? So A is the total wealth of the dynasty. So that consists of real asset wealth. That's wealth held in the form of trees, real assets, minus any debt a dynasty took out. Okay, so what's that? So P is the price of a tree and D is the debt position. So what's that debt? So we're going to assume that you have a standard borrowing constraint. Okay, so let me microfound a borrowing constraint here. The exact microfoundation actually doesn't really matter for our results, but let me just give you one precise, simple microfoundation. We're going to assume that part of your real assets, we're going to call housing. Okay, and let's say, or land. And let's say that L of these L is the number of real assets that are called housing or land, and we assume that you can borrow up against the value of your land. So you can go, let's say, and take out debt up to 100% of the value of trees that make up your land or housing. Okay, so this gives you this borrowing constraint. Now, if I, for instance, want to, see what happens in this economy if I, allow them to borrow more against their land or their house, then I would just simply increase the number of trees that I call land, and so that would be an increase in L. Okay, say an increase in LTV. Now, it turns out that this precise condition works super well in steady state, and that it gives you a very natural condition that when the price of land goes up, then you can also borrow more. But in continuous time, for everyone who worked with continuous time models, this will be very clear. It doesn't really work because the debt position here is a stock variable and the price here is a flow variable, a jump variable. So that can jump on impact when there's a shock. So that's why we write a slightly smoother version of this where we don't, take the stock and bound it above, but we take new debt issuance and bound it above a fraction of the value of land. In the steady state, it is still exactly the condition I explained to you, but in the dynamics, it's a bit smoother. But again, this doesn't really matter. What's key for this is that when the price of land or of trees increases, then you can borrow more. That's all we need from this description. Okay, so the market clearing condition is basically that the sum of the two debt positions has to be equal to zero. So it's in zero net supply, closed economy. And so that will pin down the natural interest rate or equilibrium interest rate in this model. So far, there's no nominal rigidities or anything. Now, because of this market clearing condition, it turns out it's sufficient to just keep track of one of these objects. And I'm going to just keep track of the debt position of borrowers because, by their name, they are going to be the ones that have a positive debt position here. Okay, so this is going to be the single state variable in the model. If you give me D, I can tell you exactly what's happening in this economy. Okay, single backward looking state variable. Now, before I characterize R, let me make one comment on this economy, just to preempt a question you might have already. And this is relating to scale invariance. Now, if you take an off-the-shelf non-homothetic model, you typically have that this model is not scale invariant. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Basically, just because of the magic of economic growth, if I gave you, let's say, $28,000 today, that would buy you enough. That would buy you as much as $200,000 worth of goods in 1900. Okay, and so this raises the question: okay, if we have that kind of a model, does that imply that as the economy grows, everybody should start to become a saver? Because in real terms, right, everybody's richer. So in other words, somebody earning $28,000 today maybe should save as much as somebody earning $200,000 in 1900. And this obviously makes no sense. And in fact, everybody, and I know some of you have done this, but everybody who they did a PhD in an expensive American city knows that living on $28,000 a year cannot afford to save much, especially say if you have to support a wife and maybe kids. Okay, and so based on our own experience, this seems like a wrong prediction of the model, and so that's why we think in reality savings preferences are probably closer to be described by either a utility that takes your wealth relative to the average wealth in the economy, or your wealth relative to sort of the average living standard, like capital Y, like average output in the economy. Okay, so our preferences, in some sense, you can interpret as being your wealth relative to the average living standard, where so far I've mentioned we just normalize aggregate output, aggregate GDP to 1. And so it looks like it's V of A, but think in the back of your mind that if you had growth and if you had investment and capital, you would want to have aggregate Y here rather than just V of A. Okay. Having said that, I'm now ready to tell you more about how we figure out what the equilibria of this economy are, but I'm happy to take questions if there's anything that came up in the middle.
No question. You can keep going.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. All right. So one of the first things that
Sorry. There is a last second question.
Yeah.
Alvaro will unmute you in a sec. Now you can speak.
Hi again. So just to clarify, the graph in the beginning is not relevant for the mechanism, right? Because the only thing that you need is that there are some savers that are very rich and there are some borrowers that are poor. You can have an open economy, for instance. Maybe the richer have assets from abroad, but there is some equilibrium or some restriction on external borrowing, and then the borrowing of the poor will change through prices the assets of the rich, right? So it's not necessary that the rich actually hold the debt of the poor.
I'm not quite sure. So who in your model would hold the debt of the poor? Is it foreigners or who would?
Yeah, maybe foreigners. Maybe foreigners. The rich have assets from abroad as well, but there is some restriction on external borrowing, and then the two are related through a general equilibrium, right?
So the key thing for us, and I'm going to explain this in the next part of the presentation, but the key thing for us is that if borrowers took out debt in the past and they now make their payments, that those payments go to a person or an entity that is less likely to sort of recycle that money and spend it back in the economy, right? So that's the key thing. This could be, we haven't written that paper yet, but this could be payments across borders, right? This could be, a Chilean household that borrows, say, from, China, and pays money to the Chinese central bank. And the Chinese central bank obviously doesn't go out and spend on, restaurants in Santiago, right? So those kinds of differences are basically that's what's at the heart, right? The difference in the spending propensity on, let's say, local goods, on goods that are produced by, like in this case, Chileans, or in my example earlier, goods by Americans, those spending propensities have to be different. I'm going to emphasize this in the next part. And that's why I showed you the plot in the beginning, because it's obvious, and there's lots of research, and I've contributed to that even myself. There's lots of evidence that rich Americans have much lower spending propensities, even out of permanent transfers, than less rich Americans. I don't know if that addressed your question. I think you had a more elaborate question, and I picked a slightly simpler one.
Yeah, it's in that line. I mean, maybe you are borrowing from China, and then you are paying back, and you are poorer. But then the guy who is very rich is saving in some asset in Arabia, I don't know, and he's getting more returns on their investment, and then you have the same kind of change in relative stock of wealth, right? And that will also have the same effect in the model.
Yes, I agree with you. So if you take, so through that lens, it's exactly the same, right? Because there's money leaving from borrowers' balance sheets, and there's money going towards savers' balance sheets. The thing that's going to be different is if they operate in completely different markets, right? If Chilean households borrow in a completely different market from where Chilean savers are saving, then there will be no sort of market price in that sort of connects the two. So in the sense, you will still have the implications for demand, but you will not have sort of the interesting interaction through the interest rate between those two groups of households, if that makes sense.
Okay,
Thanks. All right. So how do we describe the equilibrium in that economy? So one of the first things I always do as a macroeconomist, I write down the Euler equation. Okay. So there's one Euler equation that will always be satisfied with equality here, and that's the Savers Euler equation. So the first term here is the standard term, right? Consumption growth with log preferences is equal to the gap between the interest rate and the discount rate. But there's now two additional terms. And basically, you can think of these additional terms as reducing the effective discount rate when you have higher eta. So higher eta in this economy will effectively make savers more patient. And you can see this even more clearly when you set consumption growth to 0 and plug in the budget constraint, meaning you solve sort of for a steady state position of these savers where they're indifferent between saving more and saving less. And if you write down the condition that you get from that is you get that the interest rate is now no longer just equal to the steady state, the discount rate in that steady state, but there's this additional term here which falls, which pushes down the effective discount rate with higher eta. Okay. So this expression here is in some sense the long-run saving supply curve. In the typical homothetic model, that's just R equals rho, right? It's this perfectly elastic long-run saving supply curve. In this model, this will depend on eta, and through eta, it will depend on how wealthy you are. So now let me plot that curve for different types of etas. Okay, so the black line here, that's the homothetic one, right? That's the perfectly elastic R equals the discount rate line. So that's the one I mentioned. Now, if eta, just for the sake of the argument, if eta were decreasing in A, meaning saving is a relative necessity, so if I make you richer, all that's equal, you spend more, then that would lead to an increasing schedule for the saving supply curve. If eta instead is increasing in A, meaning saving is a luxury, you only do it if I make you richer, that would lead to a decreasing long-run saving supply curve. Okay, and the way to read this is not that this describes a world where if I cut the interest rate, these savers are gonna save more, but it's a world where if I'm this rich here and I get richer over time, then I don't need all that money to consume. So on average, I would save it. And so to keep me indifferent between saving and dissaving, the interest rate that is offered to me has to fall. Okay, so that's basically the interpretation between why in a world where savers save more than borrowers, you have this falling saving supply curve. The richer these guys are, the more the interest rate has to come down, or else they're going to keep accumulating wealth. Okay, now this is this is the supply curve. This is one condition for steady states in this economy. Now, obviously, where there's a supply curve, there has to be a demand curve. So that demand curve is going to come from the borrowing constraint of borrowers. Okay, borrowers will be at the borrowing constraint most of the time. And so their debt position is basically given by the value of pledgeable assets, the value of land or housing that they have. And that's basically this L, the number of these trees, times the price of a tree, which is 1 over L. So 1 over R. So that's L divided by R. So that's the sort of demand curve for debt. And if you put these two together, you find that they intersect exactly once. And this intersection here corresponds to the unique steady state of this economy. Now, you could have multiple steady states like here, but this would require a different borrowing constraint. So with this one I wrote down, you just have a unique steady state. Now, let me do one crucial experiment in this economy. Let me assume we are in this steady state. So there's a certain amount of debt borrowers have, there's a certain amount of wealth savers have. And now I'm going to do one change. I'm going to assume that borrowers have to finance $1 additional of debt. And what that means is basically every period now they have to pay a certain amount of interest rate expenses to savers. And I'm going to ask, what does that do to aggregate demand? So this is in some sense the cleanest experiment to see whether aggregate demand is influenced or not by a higher level of debt that an economy starts with. Okay, so to be precise, I'm in the steady state. I raise the debt service cost just by a little bit, and think in the back of your minds that just comes from them having to finance a higher position of debt. And then I'm asking, okay, what happens once you have that permanent transfer from borrowers to savers every instant, some dx? What happens to aggregate spending? And I'm going to ask this in partial equilibrium with a fixed interest rate, and later on we can study what happens when the interest rate adjusts. Now, when you crank the math, you find the following expression. I'm going to talk you through this. So aggregate spending, right, is obviously consisting of spending of borrowers and spending of savers. Now, spending of borrowers is actually very easy because they're up against the borrowing constraint always. So if I make them pay dx every instant to savers, they're going to just cut back their spending by dx. So this DCB term is just negative dx. What about savers? Now, if savers are perfectly homothetic, if they perfectly smooth consumption, just like in the permanent income hypothesis, then getting an additional permanent transfer of dx every instant, they would just increase their spending by dx every instant because it's a permanent transfer and there's an MPC of 1 with respect to permanent transfers. And so that would be perfectly offsetting the cutting of consumption by the borrowers. And so you would get a 0 in a homothetic economy. Now, what happens if the economy is not homothetic? What happens if eta is increasing in A, which is our preferred way of looking at the world? Then you get this expression. And if you just glance at this expression, you can see that this ratio here, that's the elasticity of eta. So that's going to be positive in our world. And if that's positive, then this whole expression will be negative. And so aggregate spending will fall in this experiment. So in other words, aggregate demand falls when there's an increase in debt service costs. And this is precisely what we're going to call indebted demand. The idea that if all else equal, I have a little bit of more debt in the economy, aggregate demand will be a little lower. The more debt I have, obviously, the lower aggregate demand will be. Okay, so this is the key idea. And now we're going to take this idea and apply it to several shocks or shifts that happen in the economy. Again, open for any questions. Just jump in at any point. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the thing I would like to do first is I would like to put 2 recent shifts that have happened in the world into the model and see how the model responds. Okay, and the 2 shifts are first, an increase in inequality, and second, what I will call financial deregulation, which you can think of just as basically an increase in the loan-to-value ratio that allow borrowers to use. Okay, so if inequality increases, that basically means we take real assets from borrowers and give them to savers. And again, think of that as sort of human capital, right? You reduce human capital of borrowers, increase human capital of savers. Now, this doesn't do anything in the homothetic model. And in fact, you can easily see this because the interest rate is always pinned down in any steady state by the discount rate. And the borrowing constraint doesn't change either. And so you have that the old and the new steady state after an increase in inequality look exactly the same. Now, this is obviously not the case in the non-homothetic economy. And in fact, what you can see is that for a fixed level of debt in this world, so here the horizontal is debt, if I make savers richer, meaning they now get a larger pie, larger share of the overall resource pie, they would save more, and hence their interest rate that they would need to be indifferent between saving and saving shifts down as sort of the saving supply curve shifts over to the left. But then for that interest rate, borrowers are like, hey, this is a really good interest rate. Let me go out and borrow more. And so for that interest rate, you have a much larger debt position that borrowers would like to take out. And so you sort of see that there's this amplification that leads to an interest rate that's even lower and a debt position that's even larger than before. So increased inequality in the non-homothetic world not only leads to lower interest rates, but also higher debt positions, and there's sort of an amplification.
Sorry, Ludwig, I have a very short question. I missed why there is an increase in inequality in the first place. This is something that you're assuming.
Yes, absolutely right. You're absolutely right. This is something I'm feeding into the model as sort of an exogenous shock, right? So I'm increasing omega S over time, and I'm reducing omega B over time. No, great question.
Okay, thanks.
Exactly. And so, I don't have to tell you, but in the last few decades, we have indeed seen a strong increase in the, say this in inequality. In this case, it's showing the top 1% income share across advanced economies. Okay, as roughly at the same time as we have seen the strong increase in debt. Now, let me do the second shift. Let me increase financial deregulation. Okay, so again, basically the way I put this into the model is I just increase the LTV ratio, or I increase L, the number of real assets that you can pledge and borrow against. Now, this does have an effect in the homothetic model, and in fact, it shifts out the borrowing constraint, so it shifts out the debt demand curve. In the short run, this will increase interest rates, and I plotted this small orange line here, which shows you the short run saving supply curve. The long run one is the flat one. The short run one is this one, the slightly increased. So in the short run, it increases interest rates, and then you see that interest rates decrease again and settle at exactly the same level. In the non-homothetic model, what happens is that, again, the short run saving supply curve tends to be upward sloping as well. So that's interesting. So interest rates do increase in the short run, but then they fall, and they keep falling and fall below their original level. And that fall basically increases that even more than it would have increased in the homothetic model. And so one thing that's interesting here is that this perspective, in some sense, brings together two trends that otherwise are sometimes hard to reconcile, namely that it is easier for people to go out and get a loan or get a mortgage in many advanced economies. But at the same time, just that shift would have predicted an increase in interest rate, right? Because it's a demand side shift. It's a shift for it's a shift in the sort of demand for debt and demand for credit. But in our model, this demand side increase in interest rates is only something that is to be expected in the short run. In the long run, it actually just aggravates the decline in interest rates. So we think that this is an interesting perspective that sort of goes together with the long run decline in interest rates and the rising financial deregulation. Okay, great. So now I've talked about these two shifts and how they impact the economy differently in our model than other models. Let me now go to policy and talk about fiscal and monetary policy and how they're different in our model, and show you that there might be some interesting things to learn from that model. Okay, so far I didn't have a government in the model. So now let me add one. Okay, and I'm going to add the simplest possible government for now. So this is basically an additional agent. That agent finances itself with taxes on savers and taxes on borrowers. So they basically take some of the fruits that these trees bear every instant, and through government debt. Okay, so this B dot is increasing government debt. And what it has to finance is basically interest expenses on existing government debt and government spend. And so this means that with government debt being a part of this, the total demand for debt is now D plus B, so private debt plus public debt. And for now, we're going to assume that the government pays the exact same interest rate as private households do. Now, this is obviously a stretch, and I'm going to explain to you how this changes once we incorporate that maybe there's a convenience yield, for instance, that governments can afford. Okay, so what happens with fiscal policy in this model? So imagine you're in a steady state and you do one of three things. First experiment is you increase government debt. Let's say you use it to cut taxes in the short run, or use it to spend. That will depress the long run interest rate, and that will crowd in household debt. So this is kind of the flip side of maybe what you were thinking of. And I'm going to explain this in detail in the next slide. The second implication is if you increase government spending, that will raise the long run interest rate and crowd out household debt. And if you do redistribution, as I pointed out in the beginning, from savers to borrowers, so you raise taxes on savers and cut them on borrowers, that will also increase in natural interest rates and crowd out government debt. And note that with homothetic preferences, none of these policies change the natural interest rate or change the debt position. So this is something that's sort of special in our model. Now, the most surprising implication might be this first one, that larger government debt depresses the interest rate. So now let me explain to you why that's maybe not so surprising. Okay, so imagine now, very precisely, we are in this steady state, and the government goes out and spends on the economy, like it increases government spending. Now, in the short run, in our model, this will increase interest rates. And this is that's the conventional thing you would expect, right? There's an increase in demand, and so central bank increases interest rates so that there's still full employment, not that there's excess demand. But over time, at some point, right, the government has to finance the debt it took out. And when it finances that debt, it has to adjust something else in the government budget constraint so that it's still satisfied. Right? So imagine what it does. It just cuts spending relative to the steady state spending it had before, so that it can have more money to finance the debt it took out. Well, but in that case, demand falls relative to what the steady state demand was here. And if demand falls, you have now a reduction in the interest rate, reduction in the natural interest rate, relative not only to the peak here that it generated by increasing government spending, but also relative to the original steady state, because it has to cut spending below the original steady state spending to have more money to finance debt. Okay, so that's the key plot, basically. It shows you that in the short run, interest rates will increase in response to deficit spending, but in the long run, it will decrease. So in some sense, government debt can contribute to lower interest rates. Now, there's one key step in this argument, which is that if I take out more government debt, it will make my government budget constraint more tight. That's really the key step in this argument. And there's obviously a question these days whether this is really the case, right? Think of, Chile, for instance, it's paying a relatively low interest rate on government bonds. And lots of other economies and advanced economies are in a similar position. So what does our model have to say if that's the case? So to see this, to explore this, let's assume that the government does not just pay the same interest rate that everybody else in the economy pays. Let's say this government bond interest rate is lower than RT, the private interest rate, by some spread. Let's, for simplicity, assume that this spread depends on B. And the natural direction it depends on B is obviously that, if you increase your debt position, then that spread falls and you approach the sort of private level interest rate as you increase your debt. And so let's ask the question, So when is it true that rising government debt actually increases the debt service cost of the government, meaning it actually tightens the fiscal space that government has access to? So this is basically the derivative of the debt service cost, which is R gov times B, relative to the level of debt. Now, one object that appears here is obviously the interest rate. And if you take this to the data, you should interpret this interest rate as the interest rate after subtracting the growth rate of the economy. So this object could well be negative for some countries in the world, right? It could be negative for the US, for maybe Chile, for Germany, etc. But in addition to that term, so this is sort of the famous R minus G term, right? In addition to that term, there's an additional term here, which has to do with how the spread changes, meaning how do you, by increasing government debt, do you increase the interest rate you have to pay on all inframarginal debt units that you already took out in the past? And that object is always positive. And so this means that just looking at R minus G through the lens of our model is actually not sufficient if you want to know whether rising debt increases debt service costs. What you want to look at is this total sum here between sort of this R minus G term, this R gov, and this additional term here, which captures how sensitive the spread is to government debt. Okay, so this can even be positive even if R gov is less than 0. Okay, think of Italy, right? If Italy announced now we're going to run a 30% to deficit to GDP or something like that, then markets would jitter, and then the spread will fall very rapidly, and you would have a much higher interest rate suddenly. So this term can be large potentially. There's also a second perspective that we offer in our paper, which is that obviously interest rates might not be low forever, right? And if they're not low forever and you sit on a huge pile of government debt, then this obviously can create problems. This can create problems regarding, say rollover risk. But aside from that, it can even create problems in that once, the interest rate would want to recover and you sit on all of that government debt, the government has to cut back on all sorts of programs in order to finance the higher cost of debt that they occur, and that can hold back basically the economy because that reduces aggregate demand. Okay, so this is all on fiscal policy. Let me jump straight to monetary policy, and I just have this slide on monetary policy, so let me explain to you what's underneath that plot I have on this slide. So far, this model didn't have nominal rigidities. Now, you can include nominal rigidities in sort of a standard way, which we do in the paper. And basically what comes out of this extension is that you have an economy where the interest rate R, which I refer to as the natural rate, now no longer always has to be equal to the natural rate. And in fact, we can have a central bank that changes R around without always necessarily having to track the natural interest rate. So we can do, for instance, a little experiment where we say, what would happen if the central bank, say, lowered the interest rate for a certain period of time? What would happen to output? What would happen to debt? And what would happen to natural interest rates once the economy wants to stop, once the central bank wants to stop stimulating the economy? And this is exactly what this plot is supposed to show. So imagine you are in a steady state where this is the steady state interest rate. So this, dotted line here, that's the steady state interest rate. And now assume the central bank goes in and says, let me cut interest rates a bit. Maybe because there's some recessionary fears that they have, maybe there's something on the horizon, so they cut interest rates. So this is all good, and they let interest rates be low for a certain amount of time. Let's say until some time capital T. And then they decide maybe the problem is solved. Let's go back and normalize interest rates, and let's go back to the original interest rate. Now, in a standard New Keynesian model, the natural interest rate is completely detached from the actual interest rate path you pick. So once at capital T, you want to go back to the original steady state, no problem. You just move the interest rate back, and you're going to be in the exact same place that you were before you did your intervention, and you're going to have the economy running at full employment, no problem whatsoever. This is not going to be the case in this economy. And in fact, in this economy, once you arrive at capital T, you will have stimulated the economy in the past, but you will have done so partly by raising the debt level. And that increased debt level, as I said, that leads to indebted demand, meaning that lowers aggregate demand. And so suddenly you're in a situation where if you were to go back to your original steady state interest rate, you would have no longer full employment. You would have a shortfall in aggregate demand. And so what you have to do in order to get full employment is you have to keep your interest rates lower for longer. You have to track the natural interest rate slowly as it slowly goes back to the steady state. And in fact, we show in the paper under some conditions, it might actually not even go back to the same steady state, or it might go only very, very slowly. And that depends on how much non-homotheticity there is, meaning what saving rate differential there is between borrowers and savers, and how much debt has been generated throughout this intervention. Okay, so in this sense, what we have in this model is a pretty nice feature that basically I think resonates with a lot of people, that monetary interventions change the path of natural interest rates going forward. There's no decoupling that the natural interest rate does some exogenous thing and monetary policy just tracks that natural interest rate. These are very sort of intertwined objects. Okay. I have one more section to go through, and then I'm happy to take all questions. So maybe the best is if I just plow through with this one section, and then I'm open for any questions on any part of the presentation.
That's great.
Perfect. So far, we've basically focused on economies that were sort of close to steady states, where the interest rate is always above the effective lower bound. And now I want to explore a world where maybe that's no longer the case. Okay, and to do so, I'm going to work with a model where the government basically pays a lower interest rate by some fixed spread psi. Okay, so that psi is like a fixed spread, a couple percent, maybe, I don't know, 3-4%, that the government pays lower than, private households pay on their debt, or private households, savers earn on their wealth. And so if I introduce a zero lower bound in this world, then that zero lower bound basically bounds the government bond interest rate above zero, which corresponds to a bound on that private return, or that private interest rate of psi. And so now what I want to explore is what happens in an economy where the actual steady state natural interest rate, R, the private interest rate, lies below what it would have to be for it to be above the zero lower bound. So this lies below its own effective lower bound, which is psi. Obviously, that steady state can't be a steady state anymore, because that would imply an interest rate that's too low. So what happens? And what's kind of nice, at least from a theory perspective in this model, is that we can actually solve in closed form what happens with the steady state in this situation. And in fact, what we find is that in this case, and this is again working in the model with nominal rigidities, that output is constantly below potential. Okay, so this here is output relative to potential, and you can prove that this expression here, which is output relative to potential, is always less than 1. And so if you look at this expression for sufficiently long, you see that this liquidity trap steady state has output that's lower the more inequality you have, the lower the taxes on savers are, and the higher the pledgeability, or the higher the amount of debt that borrowers have is. Okay. It is also lower if government debt is higher, but that's something I can explain to you later on. It has to do with basically that government debt pays a convenience yield. So what's interesting about this liquidity trap steady state? One thing that's I think nice is that this corresponds to a stable steady state of the model. So this is not a sunspot liquidity trap, as you see in some of the existing papers on the liquidity trap. This is actually a stable steady state that you can sort of ram into as you have some parameters change in the model. So for instance, if I increased income inequality even more than I talked about before, you can have that the interest rate, the private interest rate, falls towards, and focus on the black line here, falls towards the zero lower bound, which is 3.5% here, again, in terms of the private interest rate, and just stays at that interest rate. And exactly at that point, when it hits the zero lower bound, the output gap opens up. So you can really see sort of in slow motion how an economy over time, this takes more than a decade here, over time gets closer and closer to the ZLB, and at some point just slams into the ZLB and has a permanent output gap. And what's kind of nice is because of this slow transition, you have this effect that anticipating the liquidity trap in the future actually pulls the economy deeper into it even faster, because people anticipate that they're going to earn less money in the future because of the widening output gap. So they cut back on their spending even earlier, which sort of makes the interest rates fall even more quickly towards the ZLB. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing you can do in this economy. A second thing I want to highlight is that one thing you might think is maybe a remedy against that, against the zero lower bound, especially in the eyes of some economists, that maybe we just want to have people take out more debt, and because that increases demand, and maybe that's a good thing in the liquidity trap. Now, if I put the economy just at sort of the cusp of the liquidity trap, and I just do this one-time sort of increase in borrowing capacity, I say, I'm going to do this policy. I'm going to allow people to borrow more. I'm going to just watch what happens. Then it turns out that, yes, this is correct, that this is a remedy in the short run. For a couple of years, this works well. The output gap increases. Everything is great. But then some point, around the point when you stop increasing the borrowing capacity, that's when really borrowers have to, you can't afford to take out more debt to finance existing debt. They have to now actually pay for that debt. And that's when suddenly the output gap falls and basically goes negative. So this, more debt in some sense in a debt trap is only a temporary remedy against something that I call a chronic disease, which is secular stagnation or a chronic shortfall of aggregate demand. So that's why we think a policy that works better here is one that is a more sustainable redistribution between borrowers and savers, from savers towards borrowers, or investments in human capital of borrowers, so that they a larger share of the pie is earned by them rather than by savers. Okay, let me conclude. So this is a project that puts forward a theory of something that we call indebted demand. And if I had to put it in one line, I would describe the idea of this paper as that aggregate demand is decreasing in the actual debt service payments that borrowers in the economy need to make to savers. And so this immediately implies that if there is more debt in the economy, that the interest rate has to fall so that demand increases. Again, back to full employment, and that has to be the case under this simple condition. And we think this is particularly relevant after the COVID crisis because debt will increase massively, and so we think this is maybe one reason why we see such low interest rates for such a long horizon. So thanks a lot for your question already, and I'm very happy to take more questions.
Great. So thank you very much, Ludwig, for such a great talk. So again, if you want to ask any questions, please fill us so in the Q&A section. We will open the mic for you. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question myself. I know it's a quite stylized model. I'd like to know if you could speculate a little bit, what would be different if agents could work?
You saying if there's labor supply in the model?
If there's labor supply, so if there is when agents get poorer or they expect to get poorer, when they could react to that by working more or working less, depending on the situation.
Yeah. So I think there's a debate in the literature how strong that effect is, in the sense that people have tried to estimate, wealth effects on labor supply, and they typically find relatively, small numbers. Now, in the theory, we could easily put that in. And in the theory, it would tend to be the case that with if you had a strong wealth effect, it would tend to be the case that savers, the richer they get, they would work less, which would probably, make the saving supply curve a bit less downward sloping. And borrowers, if they get very poor, they would work more. But remember that as you have a reduction in the interest rate, as borrowers take out more debt, through general equilibrium effects, because you need to have that reduction in order to have aggregate demand be high, you would actually you would actually have that these borrowers, they're not hurting that much with high debt levels because the interest rate falls. So that effect on borrowers' labor supply, I don't think would be that great. I think the biggest effect would come from savers working less because they're very rich. So that, I think, is the key effect that we would get if you have, say, labor supply in both agents. I don't think the borrowers would work a tremendous amount more because they're hurt by having to spend more on debt. All else equal, if debt is higher, but then the interest rate also comes down a bit, and so that benefits them, and that's why it's unclear to what extent they would actually work more. And I think that's mostly a hypothetical scenario, in the sense that I think at least I can see sort of a strong relationship between, let's say, hours worked and wealth. In the sense, Elon Musk works like 120 hours a week or so, but he's I don't know, in the top 10 or 15 richest people in the world. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is Juan Blasiuk. Juan, you can speak now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was very clear and nice, and of course very interesting. So my question is very simple. Understanding the mechanism that you propose, why the interest rate could eventually go down as income inequality increases. Do you have an idea of the implications for aggregate saving? So in particular, is this consistent with the decreasing saving rates at the aggregate level, that we have observed over the last 30, 40 years?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So it is in the following sense. Remember that in a closed economy, saving is equal to investment. I think there's an echo, but so saving is equal to investment. And so what you have in literally this economy is that there is no increase. In fact, if you take the aggregate saving rate, there's no increase in that saving rate. The only increase there is in saving of the rich, and there's equal dissaving of the poor. So on an aggregate level, there's no change of the saving rate in this model. Now, you could obviously add a capital stock here and say, okay, what happens if you have that? Because then you have some investment, and so investment is not mechanically equal to zero. But even with a capital stock, it can be that the aggregate saving rate is unchanged, let's say, purely because firms don't want to invest. And I think if there's one thing that we've seen over the past few decades is that, at least in many advanced economies, many firms did not increase their investment despite very, very low interest rates. And if you put that into a model, even with one with capital, you would not see any change in saving again at the aggregate level. All you would see is this strong distributional effect where the rich are saving more and the non-rich are saving much less. And that distributional effect is something we document in our companion paper, The Saving Glut of the Rich, which literally focuses on making those points. But it's obviously, I think it's a huge question out there. Why, for instance, investment hasn't increased more, but conditional on that fact, we can match any saving rate you like. Key for us is the distribution of saving behavior.
Next, Álvaro Aguirre. After that, Andrés Fernandez.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Yeah. So I was wondering what if you have instead of this quantity constraint on debt, you have a spread on borrowing, right? Because this family maybe will be facing higher interest rates. That will, I guess, will have a similar effect on demand because debt will adjust. But I'm not sure if the way you measure the neutral interest rate will be affected by that. I guess at least in the model will be, right, because the interest that equates savings and borrowing will go up with risk and with the amount of debt. So I'm not sure, but then what we observe in the data that the interest rate is going down may be affected or maybe an outcome of the type of constraint that you have.
So let me try to understand your question. So there's I think the first part of your question is one about what kind of borrowing constraints we can put into the model. And I think there, any borrowing constraint that basically gives you this kind of downward sloping relationship between the interest rate and the debt position works for us. So let me give you a precise example. If you take our borrowing constraint, but you modify it and you don't say it's just sort of L, the number of, let's say, the amount of land you have divided by R, but it's maybe L divided by R plus a spread. And that would still fully work with us, no problem. And it has very similar implications. Now, the second thing you said, I think, was what happens if you, in that world or in some other world where you have a spread, you increase that spread. And I think to me, the interest rate that these private households pay, I would almost like to think of that already as R, right? R is for us the private interest rate. So I would say that spread, I would include that in R, so to speak.
Right.
And I would say that spread is basically one that maybe increases between the private interest rate and the interest rate that the government pays. And I know for instance Ricardo Caballero and Alp Simsek and Emmanuel Fari and Pierre-Olivier Gourachas, they have basically explored what happens in a world where that spread increases, which I think is maybe very relevant in the economy. And if that spread increases in our world, actually that makes our problem worse in the sense that, it makes you hit the zero lower bound even more quickly, right? Like, remember that plot I showed, I can quickly go there, showing when you hit, the zero lower bound. Well, it's whenever that steady state private interest rate, which includes that spread, right, is below a government rate of 0 plus the spread, which is just the spread, right? And so if that spread increases, then you're gonna fall into the zero lower bound much more quickly. And so that's why this is, it's sort of an amplification force that makes our problem worse. Now, there's a data question related to what you asked, which is, in the data, do we see just an increase in the spread, or do we also see a reduction in the private interest rate, not just in government interest rates? And I think here the answer is a resounding yes. And no matter how you measure it, the return on wealth and the interest rate people pay on, say, mortgages has come down pretty much dramatically around the world. So I think it goes in the same way, but the spread could explain why maybe government bond yields have fallen even more than private interest rates. Sorry, this was a long answer, but this was a great question. Thanks.
Thanks. Next one is Andres Fernandez. Andres, you can speak now.
Yes. Hi, Ludwig. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear very well.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting, very thought-provoking paper.
Thank you.
I have a few reactions and questions. Let me see how many I can flesh out without abusing your time. The first is somewhat related to, I believe, what Alvaro asked at some point in the presentation, which is the open economy dimension of this. I understand that your model is a closed economy, but from those of us coming from that literature on open economy, there is this influential idea of the savings glut by Bernanke, right? Which is this surge in the demand from emerging markets for U.S. assets that has pushed interest rate down.
Yeah.
You are, in a way, challenging that, aren't you?
So I actually think of that as being very complementary to what you're saying. So let me go back a little bit in the presentation and put up the bar plot I had in the beginning. So basically, all we're trying to say is that in addition to the global saving glut, and this is something that we do at length, we talk about at length in our companion paper, The Saving Glut of the Rich. Basically, we outlined that there was an additional saving glut, not just the global saving glut, which was this saving glut of the rich, that happened. And we do this for the US, but I imagine you could do something like that for other countries too. And I think that would be super interesting. That happened over the past few decades. And that was that rich Americans got even richer and started saving a ton. And both effects combined can basically explain a large chunk of household debt and government debt holdings, that accumulation by the rich and by the rest of the world. Now, let me note something, and this is only partly visible in this plot. Here you see that household debt, and this was surprising to us, but household debt is primarily owned by domestic savers, by the top 10% in the US. The rest of the world does hold a large chunk here, but it's nowhere near as large as what domestic savers own. If I had the plot here, we had to do the same plot for government debt as well. And what we show there is that it was more comparable for government debt. So the rest of the world, in relative terms, invested more money into government debt relative to household debt. But domestic savers basically in relative terms saved more in household debt. And this, I think, is in line with how we think, central banks in, say, Asia invest in the US. I mean, they primarily buy treasuries. So I think of those two as key driving factors of declines in interest rates. that happened in the US. And so I don't think at all as those being sort of substitutes. I think of them as being, complements, and that they both help us explain why interest rates are low and why saving in the US has increased.
No, I understand your answer. Thank you. I meant them being rivals in the sense that quantitatively, at least from that graph, you would expect the savings glut story to be much of a less importance than the domestic savings glut that you're mentioning.
Absolutely right. So that's misleading in this plot here, because this is just household debt. If I showed you government debt, you see it's more, in line. And we do a sort of more dynamic comparison where we actually track sort of year on year how much more saving went into these assets in this companion paper. And there we show that they're roughly of the same order of magnitude. So think of basically the saving glut of the rich and the global saving glut being roughly of the same order of magnitude in terms of accounting for increased saving in US assets since around 1980.
Got it.
So
okay,
definitely of the same order of magnitude. Thanks for asking and giving me an opportunity to clarify that.
Let me ask another question. This Absolutely. Is more related to the policy implication. I'm not sure if you are you treating the policy options from a Ramsey perspective. If you did, I missed that.
No, we don't. So, okay. Right. So I haven't mentioned the word welfare for a reason, because it's very hard to, I think, do a proper welfare analysis here. So all I've been doing is I've, focused on, policy, experiments, basically. Just, give you the positive predictions that our model has for specific policies you can run. And I think those are already quite interesting and maybe different from the conventional wisdom that's out there. I think it would be interesting to do a Ramsey planning problem here. The only problem is a bit that you would have to take sort of that, bequest, warm globe bequest motive very seriously as utility. And I mean, I think there's a whole host of other reasons why people at the top save, and also why borrowers borrow a lot. They can think of a million behavioral reasons why that's the case, for instance. And I'm not sure I'd be sort of ready to jump into that enterprise of actually, taking a stance and writing down the Ramsey problem. That's why we haven't done it here. But it's definitely worth thinking about. Absolutely.
I was thinking that maybe the Ramsey planner would internalize the heterogeneity in MPCs and would end up doing something along the lines of the redistributive policies that you mentioned.
Yeah. So that's a great intuition, and in fact, one thing we do show for welfare is that if you are at the ZLB, then redistribution is Pareto improving for both agents. So I take money away from the saver and give it to the borrower every period. Once you are in a sort of demand depressed economy at the ZLB, that is a Pareto superior allocation for both borrower and also savers. So that's something that we show, but we don't do a formal Ramsey problem. But I would expect that, given that there's a Pareto improvement here, that the Ramsey planner does something similar. So that's a great intuition.
Okay. No, this actually is good, and it leads me to my last question, and this is very pertinent for Chile, because we also hit the ZLB not too long ago.
Yeah.
So not surprisingly, there's a lot of discussion as to which policies would be more effective in getting us out of the recession. But here, I would be very cautious in extrapolating the results of your paper here, because again, for the open economy dimensions alluded to earlier, but not this time thinking about the US, but from an emerging market perspective. Because here, correct me if the intuition is wrong, but wouldn't it make sense for the government to borrow heavily and distribute some of these fresh income to lower income households with high MPCs? So here that would pay out?
So that depends. And this is what I try to explain here, right? So that depends on what happens to the debt service cost that the government has to pay. So if I don't know the details, but if you know the average the average borrowing rate, RGov, let's say it's a 10-year Chilean government bond rate. If that rate would is below the growth rate and would not increase very much if the Chilean government borrows more, then I fully agree with you, right? Because then if you borrow now and you don't expect you don't expect the Chilean government bond rate to increase in the future above G, and you don't expect the spread to fall so much that the actual debt service cost actually increase, then yes, that is a policy that you can run, and that is a policy that would sustainably increase aggregate demand. However, once these things are not satisfied, then this policy would reduce demand in the future, precisely when the Chilean government has to do something, let's say cut back expenses or cut back entitlements, and when it needs to finance the increased debt service cost in the future. So that's really the trade-off. It's all about basically if the debt service cost increased or not. Now, obviously, even if it increases, right? If the increase, and this is always super hard to predict in a democracy, so that's why it's a bit of a of a nuance here, and it's unclear exactly whether this would work. But if the increase in debt service cost was paid, say, by a wealth tax or by a tax on the very rich, then it would not have adverse consequences. But to the extent that it's financed using, I think, what in a democracy you can expect, either by cutting expenses, entitlements, or by increasing taxes on a broad base of people, then it would be reducing demand going forward, and would hence reduce interest rates going forward and make the zero account more binding in the future.
Okay. Yeah, I agree that it has to do with spreads and the dynamics of them. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So probably with the panelists, we could keep chatting a little bit in private sessions. But for the seminar, I think we should call it a day. Thank you very much, Ludwig, for being with us.